Hello, everybody. My name's Dhemerae.
And I'm Sarah.
And together we are the TheLaserGirls.
That we are. This is the second video for our Comic-Con Chronicles series that you can also see more content for on our blog at TheLaserGirlsStudio.com, where we do all kinds of 3D printing tutorials, informationals, etc. Whatever. We love 3D printing, and that's what we're here to talk about.
So if you're new to what we're doing here, a few weeks ago, Sarah and I went to New York Comic Con dressed as Lightning from Final Fantasy XIII, as Cloud from either Final Fantasy VII, which was my costume, and Sarah did Advent Children Cloud.
So obviously we have the classic Buster Sword. This is a hugely ambitious piece to do. Why don't you walk us through kind of the construction aspect of this and maybe some challenges that you ran into while 3D modeling this?
Sure. So the Buster Sword was ultimately made by printing, I believe, 8 parts to create the entire sword. Now the sword is, I believe the sword is around 5'4", including the handle. So, with the printing technology that I decided to go with, which is good for creating snap fits and mechanical components and has a really nice, smooth, high-resolution finish, I could only fit about 16 inches of plastic into the printer. So the whole sword was constructed in SolidWorks. And first, I built the entire sword. I didn't really think much about how the pieces were going to fit together yet. And then once the whole sword was built to scale, I then began the process of slicing it up into pieces that would fit in the printer.
So go into detail more about how you created the mechanism for all the pieces to get together, because this was the mechanism that I also used for mine.
Yes.
Because
and actually,
it really worked well.
Well, it actually worked better for your sword than mine, and I'll actually go into that now. So the pieces basically they just slot into each other. But on the ends of those pieces, there are holes to fit neodymium magnets. And anyone who knows what those are, they're rare earth magnets that are extremely powerful. And so I was thinking, this was my crazy idea, that I would connect the whole sword together with magnets so that then they could be deconstructed and stored in a way that would be easy, and they could even be transported or in a suitcase. They'd fit in a suitcase.
Right. You're thinking modularly.
I'm thinking modularly. And I thought, that would be such a cool way to do the sword, something that people haven't done before, because people have printed full-size Buster Swords. I'm not the first one to do that. So I wanted to kind of put my own spin on it and make it like a modular thing, something you could take apart. I built it so that it would fit together with magnets. And, one of the issues, though, that I found out, and this is something that I didn't anticipate that I should have, but the material that I was printing in has a little bit of flexibility to it, which is important for some snap fits, for example, because you need that flexibility for the snap fit function to work properly. So I was like, well, this is perfect. Unfortunately, it meant that the material was flexible enough that it was bending. As I was picking the sword up, it would sort of it would kind of bend in one direction.
Kind of bow in the middle.
It would bow in the middle, which is ultimately weakening the magnetic joinery. And the magnets worked. They worked.
They absolutely did.
They worked great. That sword wasn't going to break in half, but I felt just me felt uncomfortable kind of waving it around, because just with the fear that there was potential for me to break it that way. So ultimately the decision, and this was sort of comes down to me making a last minute decision on this, but I kept the magnets in the sword and I ended up epoxying the pieces together. So the sword, you could take the sword apart, but that would require you kind of loosening the epoxy that was in between the two pieces.
I also had the same issue with mine, and I ended up having to glue
a couple
my
of
pieces
them
together.
Did we glue all of them together?
I think I'm afraid to touch it. So
the cool thing about Sarah's sword is, my sword's very thin. Which is
it's very thin.
Which is what led to the bowing, because it's such a thin it was such a thin sword that the plastic also had to be thin. Sarah's sword, the Advent Children Cloud sword, is a lot thicker. So I think the magnets actually worked beautifully for your system because of the way that the sword is made. It actually lent itself to being a really strong connection. And so we didn't even need to glue your pieces together, but we thought, just to play it safe, because we were going to a convention, we were going to be posing, swinging the sword around. The magnets are still in our swords for that extra structural stability. But what's cool, the reason why I decided to do the epoxy as well that sort of led into this is that I wanted to hide my seams, the print seams. So what I ended up doing was I had epoxied the seam and then just sanded it down.
You also, though, did a really good job of incorporating the seams into the design of your sword
I did.
as well. And that's always something to think about.
That's one of my kind of more proud moments during this process was I really did think about how my print seams were going to lend itself to the design of the aesthetic of the sword itself. And I actually think that was very successful.
Right.
Like that was probably my most successful part of the sword was actually taking that into account. Now, what I loved about this project was I learned a lot about structural engineering during this process for making this sword, and I know I could make it better, and I know for the next time I could make it so that I could just use magnets and I wouldn't need to use epoxy.
Right.
And I could remake the sword so that it didn't bow. So there's a whole lot of things. I learned so much during this process that I actually want to remake it. And I want to redo it better with a larger printer.
And that's something, just for those who don't know kind of scale-wise what 3D printing can offer. Right now, the largest print platforms are only about...
I think they're like 3 feet long. Like I know the EOS, the larger scale nylon printer, I think is like almost 3 feet or something in one direction.
But a lot of 3D printing vendors, for example, your platform size
average, on average it's gonna be about like 16 inches by like 10 by 8 or something. Like they're not that large. Just think about a MakerBot platform. That's the average build size for most 3D printers.
And 9 times out of 10, you're probably not going to want to print chunks that large anyway.
The larger your object, the higher percentage that your print will fail.
Right, and consistency across each layer.
Exactly.
The larger print that you have, the longer time the print heads are extruding across each slice, and that...
Which increases the chance for print failures.
Right.
Or defects in the print. And it also depends on how you're going to finish it, too.
Right. So that's actually a really great segue,
into the next
finishing, which we kind of discussed a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
You were definitely very particular compared to me in regards to how you wanted this to look. I had more of a difficulty finding reference sources that really captured kind of exactly what this sword looked like. But with this, you didn't have that issue. What you had, which was potentially an issue, but kind of sort of not really, was so much reference material and so much information out there that had all the particulars for this sword.
Yes.
So that really not only posed an ease for you to develop, you know, the colors and the look, but also kind of posed a challenge because you had, so much information to make every detail so particular.
So this was interesting. Our paint process ultimately was a 4-part process. So 4-part paint process with sanding in between each layer.
Crazy? Yes.
It's crazy. It was crazy. And we used an auto grade paint that has metal powder into the paint itself.
Aluminum powder.
Aluminum powder is in the paint. It simulates chrome. And we thought that would be a really kind of a cool idea in making these swords, to make them have like sort of a chrome effect. And it's honestly, the results are not really chrome. For those of you who know what chrome looks like, it's actually more of a silver, which works fine anyway. So we wanted to take this chrome process and we wanted to make a dual tone chrome color for both of our weapons. My sword is dual tone, and Sarah's sword definitely has hints of being dual tone throughout it. And we'll show you kind of some pictures so you can get an idea. So we needed a light silver and a dark silver. And I sort of wanted my parts to look more like steel.
Right.
So we basically went through a process of test painting, I think like 8 different colors and different chrome processes too. So we did like unprimed, we did primed, we did like white all the way through black, and just trying to see what results we were happy with. And that was like weeks worth of testing. And I think we ultimately landed on 2 paints that we really liked. Once we got them painted, however, I mean, I hadn't had the practice painting something so large, and I really wanted to get the most reflective surface I could. So I ended up unknowingly overpainting one of the layers that lends itself to having a more reflective surface, which is basically just clear paint. It was just a clear coat of paint, which was the primer for the metal powder to adhere to.
Like a glossy top coat.
I overdid it, and this actually kind of made it cool, and I think everyone sort of agreed with well, I didn't think it was cool at the time. It was a combination of using different primer colors that were not from the company that makes the urethane paint, and a combination of not letting the layers dry in between coats, and a combination of over painting.
It's a very delicate process.
All of that lent to my clear coat cracking. Which, I mean, ultimately, I think it really gave the Buster sword like a really gorgeous weathered look to it. And it made it look used, it made it look real. And I honestly am really, like, it was a happy mistake, but I still wish I didn't do it. You know, like, I wish I had more control over the material. Like, I thought I knew what I was doing, but obviously I didn't know what I was doing. But it ended up working out perfectly.
Right.
And I couldn't have asked for, I didn't do, just so you guys know, I hardly did any weathering on my sword.
Right.
I actually don't think I did any weathering on my sword.
I did a lot.
Sarah did a lot on hers, and basically the weathering process involved taking brown, black acrylic paint and coffee and just kind of like wiping it, dry brushing it, and then rubbing it off.
Really, 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 really watered down.
Really watered down, and you do it in layers. So you don't make it look like you have too much dirt on there all at one time, and you build it up slowly. I didn't do any of that on my sword because I already felt that the cracking and the bubbles within the paint were contributing to that weathered look without making it look dirty. So I already thought I had completed that process unknowingly and not on purpose. It pays to not be overly obsessive about the work that you're doing. I had a really clear vision of what I wanted the sword to look like, and it wasn't meeting my vision. But I think, honestly, my vision was something that I feel like my vision was incomplete. But I think what I made was complete. To me, that was even better, what I got. My results.
You can only plan so far ahead, right? You have to have that balance of having a strong sense of direction, but also kind of allowing the processes to just happen and let go control in areas that are necessary, and you will come to a fantastic result.
Yeah.
That's something that, with every project, that balance is always going to be a little difficult to find at the beginning. And we run into this all the time. This is only our second costume.
This was and I want to talk about this a little bit if you don't mind. This was the first time I had worked with leather in such an extensive way. And I will say, like, the sword, I loved my sword, and I loved all my modular pieces. Like, I loved how I was able to create this piece right here and how it opens with the magnets. Like, that enclosure system I fell in love with, but my crowning achievement was my leather bodice. I wanted to take it upon myself to learn a new skill, and leather working is a skill that, I mean, people spend their whole lives working in leather, and they do it professionally, and that's, like, obviously I don't think I'm that great with what I made, but I watched a lot of tutorials on, and I'll link these tutorials when we get this video out there. I watched a ton of tutorials on how to make leather belts and just different ways people make leather belts, and I bought all the tools, and I got them, like, cheap on Etsy secondhand. and I tried to use the techniques that people who work in leather use to make my objects, and I thought I'm really proud of myself. I thought I did a great job. Almost nearly everything on that costume is held like with a mechanism. It's there's hardly any glue. The only glue I did use on that piece was to glue my design filigree on the center detail. The center detail, and you'll see that. But the glue was what failed.
Yep.
Unfortunately, pieces kept popping off and I used a really strong epoxy, but I think leather, you need to use a specific type of glue for the leather that I didn't use. I just used a 2-part epoxy, and it didn't hold. So it's funny that like I felt so proud of myself because the belts and things that I had actually made my costume put into the leather, they function, and they're gonna function forever.
Right.
So I'm really proud of myself for that, and I am also really proud that I decided to use actual real leather. It's bridal leather for creating saddles.
Yeah.
So
definitely a bit of a splurge, but totally worth it.
It was a splurge. I will say that we are gonna use every inch of that hide.
Yes, we have a lot left.
We have a lot left, but it's such a beautiful material, and I have a great respect for it. Like, I love that material, so we're going to continue to use every single inch and scrap of it until it's gone. And we already have ideas for our next costumes about how we're going to incorporate it.
What I think was really exciting for us going into this is not only the 3D printing challenges, but also the non-3D printing challenges that these costumes presented to us. In your case, you really took to the leather working.
To a new material. And now I want to kind of learn even more. So I'm really excited about
And you're probably going to incorporate some 3D printing into leather working that you do.
And now that you bring that up, that is going to be heavily used in my next large costumes. And something about like when you like making things, you start to fall in love with material. And you start to fall in love with the capabilities of material, and you start to push those capabilities just innately, just you being passionate about learning more things about different materials you can use to make stuff with. I think like anyone, if you guys are working on making your own costumes, my advice is to really understand your materials. Take the time to kind of figure out like, will this dissolve if I put glue on it? Like how will it react to paint? Or can I carve into it? Can I sculpt it? Can I take it? Can I make a mold from it? Like really take the time to really understand how your material is going to work, and also experiment. Like don't be afraid to try new materials out and fail with them, because we certainly, people who work in 3D printing especially understand that material is the thing. It's prototyping. So
that's what you're doing. You're iterating and experimenting.
Yeah, and try and just remember, even if you have a goal in mind, try and remember that you're learning throughout the whole process, and you should always work on learning more about what you're doing during the process of making. So rather than just focusing on the end goal, you should really sit down and kind of figure out what new things you're going to try and how they're going to work out, and get excited by just that. Because that's really what makes it fun. We were stressed out throughout this entire process, but I was having so much fun. I want to encourage everyone to just be passionate about materials and really kind of dive into it with like hands up in the air and like blindfolded and just go for it, so.
All right.
Don't work with dangerous materials blindfolded. By the way, I'm not endorsing that.
That about closes kind of the highlights of the costume for you.
And if you have any questions about any of the pieces, particulars of the pieces that I made for my costume, you should feel free to hit us up.
Please check out TheLaserGirlsStudio.com for more content on 3D printing and how to get involved in 3D printing and cosplay and ZBrush and SolidWorks. All sorts of fun stuff. With that,
from Dhemerae and Sarah, we will see you in the next video.
Go Laser.